everyone. So because we lost a week of the semester, we had to cut a wrinkle in time and our discussion behind why we create children's literature and also why is science fiction so popular with preteen and teenage audiences, that part of our class discussion. So part of what I want to do today in today's mini lecture is to address those questions, and I also want to ask you to think about the cultural context of Ender's Game and how you maybe see that context potentially shaping the novel's development so far. So to start with the first topic, which is children's literature. Children's literature, as we know it and recognize it today, is a fairly new genre. During the early modern period into the 17th, 18th century, most material written expressly for children was religious and moral literature that was meant to instruct children in their faith and in their moral lives. Moving into the 1800s, though, more and more people start to write fictional stories specifically for children. In the English-speaking world, for example, stories like The Jungle Book, Treasure Island, The Secret Garden, all of these became popular. And also during this time, throughout Europe, people like Hans Christian Andersen, people like the Brothers Grimm, started writing down and publishing their local fairy tales. Well, many of the novels written for children were less directly about moral instruction. Many of them were still written to encourage children to develop certain traits or to learn certain lessons or to conform to different roles. To use an example of the early 20th century story of Peter Pan and Wendy, it's a story in which children are encouraged to seek adventure, to be brave in the face of the unknown, which in the context of the early 20th century was often the colonial other, and to be, imaginative as well. All of these are kind of lessons that are contained in that story. It also, however, suggests that even in the middle of a grand adventure, the only female main character should be the mother for all these male characters. And also, the boys get to have the bigger, grander adventures, so there's a lot of gender roles being taught through that story as well. It also suggests that as great as childhood and imagination are, it's a good thing to grow up and become working men and mothers. So I'd like you to think through some of the popular children's stories of your youth. I'm sure that you can think of many that follow this kind of teaching pattern. For example, even most 1990s Disney movies have some kind of a lesson, whether that be follow your dreams, it's okay to be different, or, Aladdin, believe in yourself. So, moral lessons are something that are not gone from the children's literature of today for sure. I'd also encourage you to think of children and young adult books that perhaps buck this trend. Especially moving into young adult fiction, especially, can you think of any examples of books that do something other than try to tell teenagers how they should be or teach them a lesson? Some of my favorite books as a middle schooler and as a high schooler were books by Catherine Patterson. Two of my all-time favorite books, especially in middle school, were Bridge to Terabithia and The Great Gilly Hopkins. I'm not sure if any of you have read either of those. I think Bridge to Terabithia remains popular today. Neither of these books, I think, necessarily tries to drive home a lesson or really tries to suggest a way for kids or young adults to change. Instead, I think that they simply tell the story of a kid who doesn't fit in, who feels like no one understands them, and then makes that kid's story seem valuable and worthwhile to tell. I think that if we think through some of the more contemporary 20th century popular young adult novels, we can think of examples of books that do the same thing. And I mention this because I'd like us to think about how Ender's Game possibly fits into the broader picture of children and young adult fiction. I also want to mention or encourage you to read Ender's Game through the lens of its cultural historical context. The novel was published in 1985 originally, but Card had been working on this and, creating story versions of this throughout the late 70s and into the early 80s. The 70s and 80s, as you probably know, were a time when the American imagination was especially interested in science fiction. We had just landed on the moon. We were still pursuing really exciting space missions. Star Wars had revolutionized American cinema. But this was also a time when the Vietnam War and Watergate were still fresh in the minds of many Americans. And these are two things that caused a lot of Americans to feel like they couldn't trust the government and that elected leaders could not be trusted to make decisions that were actually good for the American people. So today I'd like you to comment in response to the question posted after this lecture in ICON. Please also remember to respond to the other discussion forum that starts us off on the question of the week. On Wednesday, please read the article I've assembled on the topic of child geniuses. And again, return to that discussion of the week forum and respond to two classmates. On Friday, we'll have our Zoom conference during class's regularly scheduled time. If you're not able to come to the conference, please contact me for an alternate assignment, preferably before the conference begins, but definitely no later than the end of the week. So Sunday night is kind of a cutoff for making sure that you contact me to get that alternate assignment. I will make exceptions for things like extreme illness or emergency. I hope you're all well. I miss you. And I do look forward, though, to seeing you all on Friday when we get to do our Zoom conference. Have a good week.